All right. Hey, how's everybody doing? I hope you're all staying safe, staying healthy. It's a little rainy outside today, so I guess it's a good day to be stuck inside. But we're going to go ahead and jump into lecture here. So I'm going to share my screen. First thing I want to talk about is come on. The first thing I want to talk about is assignment 3. So assignment 3 is up on Blackboard. It's due on Sunday. It's it's not designed to be a difficult assignment, and I've provided some sources for you to review and then respond to the questions. So it should be fairly straightforward in terms of understanding what I'm asking you to do. You know, Mostly what I want you to do with the assignment is just basically just engage with the current issue that's going on, get some information about it, and respond to some questions. So that's due on Sunday, and I'll post an announcement. But on Thursday, I'm gonna hold some office hours. I'm trying to play with Collaborate a little bit, but I'll let you know on Blackboard. But I'll let you know whether it's going to be Zoom or Blackboard Collaborate. But look for an announcement about that. And I'd like to hold regular kind of virtual hours from here on out. But I do want you to remember that if you want to talk, you want to discuss anything in the class, we can make an appointment. We can talk on the phone or via Zoom or whatever you're most comfortable with. If you have questions about anything course related, of course, I'm more than happy to talk with you about it at a different time. So what we did last lecture is we taught. Oh, and there's my cat Marvin. He's just hanging out, so he's joining us today, I guess. If you remember last time, we were talking about policy analysis, and we talked about defining and analyzing a problem. I'm just going to get my drink here. We talked about defining and analyzing a problem. Today, we're going to talk about thinking about policy alternatives. So once we've analyzed the problem and kind of understand the characteristics of the problem, the extent, the magnitude, who's affected by a problem, in terms of policy analysis, the next step is to think about potential policy alternatives or policy solutions. What can we do to address the problem? All right, so this is where we think about constructing policy alternatives. And among the different options that we have, and we've talked about these in class, we've got regulation, which is kind of this command and control, do what I'm telling you to do, or there's a penalty. You have government management, where the government can kind of take control of the situation and provide resources or services to a population. You have taxing, and then you have spending, taxing to disincentivize a certain behavior, spending to stimulate, right, a certain behavior. We also have market mechanisms, which we can kind of think about as like cap and trade, which is kind of a rare example that we don't see quite that often in the real world. And then we also have education, information, and persuasion, which is a really, voluntary type of mechanism to encourage people to behave in a particular way. So we also have, once you've established a policy and seen it kind of implemented and monitored the effect of that policy, you can also modify existing policies, right? So this can be used, modification, amendment of a law or something like this, right, can be used to modify an existing policy, strengthening it, weakening it, changing the mechanism, the type of instrument that you're using. And these are all different options, right? So, again, a lot of times what we see in the real world is a combination of different policies. And the next assignment, I'm going to ask you to kind of look at some policies around the coronavirus. But what we're seeing and what we often see in reality, especially when we're dealing with a complex public problem, are the application of multiple policy instruments, different types of tools that are used to address the public problem, right? So just because we talk about regulation or taxing and spending to simplify a situation doesn't mean that that's the only tool It doesn't mean that we can only apply one thing, right? We can apply multiple tools to address any particular problem. Um, so again, just for the sake of examples, when we talk about these things, usually I'm just focused on one particular instrument, but it's important to understand that these instruments are often used in combinations with one another. So let's say we're looking at a problem, right? I think we talked in the last lecture about cell phone use, potential solutions to distractions of cell phones in driving. And we've come up with some potential solutions, right? Some type of technological fix um, that kind of designs phones so that maybe they shut off while you're driving. That's one potential policy. Another potential policy is regulation, right? Command and control rules, which we do see in practice a lot, where if you're driving and you're on your cell phone, you may get a ticket. Um, that's a command and control. That's a form of regulation. Another potential policy alternative is information and persuasion, right? When you're driving or if you're going out on, some highways or freeways, a lot of times, I don't see them so much out here, but in California, we'd see them a lot over the freeway, signs that say, don't text and drive. These types of things are designed as informational campaigns to kind of persuade you not to behave in a certain way, right? So let's say we're looking at a problem, and we'll do this with assignment 4 with the coronavirus, but we're looking at a problem and we've got different policy alternatives or tools that we can use to address the problem. Now, the next thing that we want to do from a policy analysis perspective is determine some evaluative criteria, because we want to determine what the solution, what policy should we use? How should we address this problem? What policy do we want to use? And so to compare, we want to compare them across different evaluative criteria, right? This allows us to weigh policy options, think about the benefits, the trade-offs of different policy options, and ultimately, with developing evaluative criteria, we want to establish some type of standardized way to compare different tools in order to then select perhaps the best tool given the different criteria that we evaluated each tool on, right? So this is what we're going to talk about next. So, essentially we have a problem, right? We've defined it, we've analyzed it, we've selected some potential policy solutions to that problem. Now we want to compare those different solutions using a standardized kind of set of evaluative criteria. And so, in the last lecture I mentioned, there's a lot of different types of evaluative criteria out there. Some common ones are effectiveness, efficiency. We'll talk about these today. You also have thinking about risks, the uncertainties of different policies, the unknowns. And there's other evaluative criteria too that we can think about more in lines of ethics, right? Equity or fairness of different policy tools. Do they impact one population more than another? How do they impact liberties and freedoms, constitutional rights, right? These are more kind of legal and ethical questions about policy approaches that we can also use as evaluative criteria to compare different policy instruments. So how do we assess these criteria, right? So let's say we pick something like effectiveness. How are we going to actually use that particular type of criteria to evaluate a particular policy instrument? Well, we want to use operational measures or indicators, right? So we talked about this last time in last class, that operational measures or indicators are really just numbers. It's just a quantitative way of understanding a particular problem, or understanding, in this case, the fit or the effectiveness, if we use effectiveness as an evaluative criteria, of a particular policy tool, right? So if we're talking about efficiency as an evaluative criteria, a common operational measure or indicator that's used to determine efficiency is dollar value, right? So a lot of times when we talk about efficiency, we talk about things like the benefits versus the costs of a particular policy tool, right? So if we're talking about cell phones and driving and regulation, let's say ticketing for the use of cell phones while driving, one of the benefits of regulating cell phone use while driving is that maybe there will be fewer accidents caused by the use of cell phones in driving, and there will therefore be fewer deaths, right? So one of the benefits of regulation in the context of cell phone use while driving, and we'd have to try to determine the magnitude of this benefit, but one of the benefits is fewer lives lost, right? Um, and we'll talk about this in the next lecture, but this is an actual benefit that's analyzed and quantified, and there's some ethical issues with determining the value of a life, but the value of lives is used in cost benefit analysis in terms of determining the efficiency of different policy instruments. So saving lives from regulating cell phone use is one benefit, right? Then we have to compare, and then there might be other benefits, lower insurance costs, different things that can be quantified, and that from an efficiency perspective, we try to quantify in dollar values. Then we have to think about the costs, right? So if we're talking about command and control regulation of cell phone use, there might be the cost of enforcement. So you've already got, law enforcement out on the roads. So the cost associated with regulating cell phone use might be relatively low, given that you already have police forces out there regulating cell phone use. Now, if you were to create like a specific cell phone police branch, right, where you have this whole new kind of contingency of police officers that are hired to regulate cell phone use, that would be perhaps a more substantial cost. But what we want to do is we pick a policy, and from an efficiency perspective, we look at kind of the dollar value of the benefits of that policy versus the cost. And if the costs are really high and the benefits are relatively low, right, then we might say, well, this policy instrument is not ideal, right, relative perhaps to another policy instrument to address the same problem, and that have relatively high benefits and relatively low costs, right? And so again, we use this evaluative criteria, efficiency, to compare the benefits and costs of different policy approaches to address the problem. A lot of times when we talk about effectiveness, what we're talking about is the likelihood of achieving or reaching a specific policy objective. And this particular evaluative criteria is really, in terms of operationalizing it or measuring it, is really reliant on, the problem that we're looking at. So if we're talking about cell phone use in driving, maybe we've established a goal of reducing automobile accidents over a certain period of time, right? And so the evaluative criteria in terms of the effectiveness of, let's say, regulation of cell phone use while driving would be to look at, automobile accidents attributed to cell phone use while driving, and how those trends have changed over time, right? And so this is a way, again, when we're picking evaluative criteria and we're comparing policy options, we often use quantitative measures to compare them, right? And so again, efficiency, oftentimes we're talking about the benefits and costs of a particular policy instrument relative to another. With effectiveness, we're talking about the likelihood that one particular policy instrument will achieve a desired policy objective versus another policy instrument, right? And so, which one is most likely to achieve the objective that we're trying to accomplish, right? And so again, this is the purpose of evaluative criteria, is to make comparisons, and a lot of times these comparisons are done using quantitative measurements, right? For this lecture, and for the class, we're really going to focus on 4 key criteria that are quite common. One, of course, as I already mentioned, is effectiveness. Another is efficiency. The third is equity. And the fourth is political feasibility, right? So each of these types of criteria are important when, again, we're comparing and thinking about policy alternatives, policy options to address a particular problem. So we'll talk about each of these in turn. We may not get to political feasibility today, but we will talk about it. So the first one, effectiveness, right? As I already mentioned, when we talk about effectiveness as an evaluative criteria, or in general, we're talking about is the likelihood of a particular policy instrument in terms of achieving the desired policy goals or objectives, right? So this type of criteria really requires analysts to think about, what are suitable indicators or measurements of a particular problem, and how can we use those measurements to track changes in that problem over time, right? And so again, as I mentioned, effectiveness is one of these evaluative criteria that's fairly unique to the problem that we're seeking to address. So again, with cell phone use and driving, you might track automobile accidents that are attributed to distracted driving from cell phone use. If we're talking about the coronavirus, right, and I'm going to ask you to do this with assignment 4, what are we tracking there in order to understand the effectiveness of the policies that have been implemented to address the problem, right? And so it's really contingent. The effectiveness, the measurement that we use to track effectiveness is really reliant on the problem that we're investigating. There are some limitations and challenges when we use effectiveness as an evaluative criteria. And again, effectiveness is a really problem-specific evaluative criteria. And so, these challenges might not apply to all issues, but they certainly apply, and some of them apply, many problems are challenged by at least one of these issues. The first one is complexity, right? So if you're looking at a particularly complex problem, you might be developing programs that are intended to achieve multiple goals, right? So, with the coronavirus, this is a relatively complex public problem, and there's multiple goals associated with policy around the coronavirus, right? And again, this will come out in the assignment, but if you look at the issue, right, of course, the key issue here is this, contagious illness that's highly contagious and spreads relatively fast, right? And it can be particularly detrimental to your health for certain populations in particular. So that's the base of the problem, but there's other problems associated with the coronavirus as well. For example, one being hospital capacity, right? And so when we implement policy to address the coronavirus problem, well, you have the base of the foundational problem of the coronavirus, right? But you also have this kind of secondary problem of hospital capacity and being able to treat people that are being exposed to the coronavirus. And so as you add more kind of layers to a problem, you add more goals to be addressed by policy to mitigate or lessen the magnitude of the problem. And this creates complexities, right? The other issue and potential limitation is the short versus long term, right? So some objectives, some policy goals might only be attainable over a long period of time, right? And so, and this creates challenges in terms of measuring effectiveness because it's difficult to really track. If we're not expecting to see changes based on some type of policy implementation, if we look at a particular problem and we know, like, look, we're going to implement a policy, but we're not going to see changes immediately, this creates challenges in tracking. And again, and I talked about this last lecture in terms of proximate versus root cause, that policymakers in the public, we like to see change happen relatively quickly. When we're confronted with a particularly challenging problem that's high on the political agenda and having significant impacts to public lives, we want to see change happen quickly. But sometimes it doesn't happen quickly, and we know that it won't happen quickly. And this is also an issue with the coronavirus. And I'm not going to get into it now, but I will ask you to think about it for assignment 4. When are we expecting to really see the coronavirus problem become, no longer a problem, right? This is an important question, but also one that's difficult to answer currently. Related to that is this issue of forecasting, making projections, right? And this is also, again, really germane or really relevant to the coronavirus problem. That when we talk about forecasting and projecting. And again, as I mentioned in the very, very, very beginning of class, that all public policy is kind of a social experiment, right? We're introduced with a problem, and in some cases a very unique problem, but sometimes we see the same problem pop up in different locations. But we still are, we're challenged with implementing a problem and understanding what the outcome will be, right? Even if you have one problem in one place and the same problem in another place, you have different populations perhaps that are being affected by that problem. And so there's always variability, whether it's variability in the problem or variability in kind of the political, social, cultural context, that it's really difficult to know upfront what a policy instrument or the application of a policy instrument to address a problem, what the outcome will be. And so a lot of times we rely on forecasting or projections. And this is really a probabilistic, a statistical estimate of effectiveness in the context of evaluating policy options. We think about evaluating the effectiveness into the future. This relies on forecasting and projections. And again, this is being used currently with the coronavirus. A lot of models are being displayed and discussed, and predictions about when the coronavirus will be less of an issue in terms of being able to open up economies. And there's a lot of challenges here. Understanding that there's uncertainty is very key. Asking about assumptions is very important. And so there's always going to be uncertainty. Nobody knows, right, based on these shelter-in-place orders, when it's, considered to be, feasible to open up an economy again. We make predictions, and there's uncertainties in those predictions. And that's currently what's being debated in a lot of news briefings, press briefings. When is it safe to open up? Well, a lot of these decisions are being based on projections and forecasts. The other challenge is ideological beliefs versus empirical evidence. And again, we see this coming up currently, and a lot of times this gets into the science versus the politics of an issue. There have been protests recently across the country. People don't like being sheltered in place. That's understandable. Some people are really taking a stance on that and showing up in large numbers to protest shelter-in-place orders and the way they're being designed. And so this is, again, an indication that when we think about different policy alternatives, we have to think about ideological beliefs, right? That policy tools are implemented in a social setting, and social settings have people in them with different beliefs and ideologies and values. And so we have to think about this when we're implementing policy instruments and understand that, based on an individual's beliefs or values, they might see weaknesses in a particular policy instrument. And in some cases, it's difficult to make everybody happy in all situations, right? If we didn't shut down the economy, there would be other people protesting. If we didn't have shelter-in-place orders, there would be other groups protesting about that policy response. And so it's important to understand that designing policy instruments and thinking about political ideologies, individual values, and how those can influence responses is important, but can be a challenge to thinking about how to address a particular problem. And this really gets into the political feasibility discussion is, how are people going to respond to an instrument? Even if we can say, like, look, this is going to produce a positive outcome, this is compounded by a long-term issue, right? We're going to implement this policy. It's going to produce good outcomes, right? The shelter-in-place order is going to produce outcomes. It takes time to see that happen. And in the meantime, people are locked up in their homes. They're getting cabin fever, right? Perhaps, right? Like, nobody likes to be like sheltered in place, I don't think. I mean, there probably are some people. I don't necessarily mind it that much because I'm not a super social being, but I do like to have the freedom to go outside, right? Most people enjoy that. But some people are really reacting in a strong way in terms of protesting. And so, when you're dealing with a problem that is kind of this long-term thing and there's uncertainty with it, sometimes you have the empirical evidence that shows, look, this is going to change if we do what we are proposing to do, but it's going to take time. This creates issues where people might not, really appreciate that time that it takes, right? So I want to dive into efficiency. And so that's the effectiveness criteria. The second one I want to talk about is efficiency. So again, this is really thinking about achieving, taking a particular policy approach, applying it to a problem, and thinking about the policy approach in terms of its benefits and costs, right? And so that's really what we're weighing here is, if we take this tool, this policy tool, and apply it to this particular problem, how do the benefits in terms of changes to the problem weigh up against the cost in terms of implementing the policy itself? So the ultimate goal here is really to get the most benefit for the lowest cost, right? This is kind of we want the biggest difference, the most net benefits, right? In terms of, and again, this is measured through an economic lens. So a lot of times we think about this in terms of dollar values. I don't know if you can see Marvin there. He's just knocked out, sleeping on the job. So, but anyway, what we think about with efficiency is getting the biggest bang for the buck, right? And that's a simple way to remember efficiency, the biggest bang for the buck. It's important to think about efficiency because the government has to justify its actions on the basis of economic concepts. And one of the reasons why policymakers do this, well, it's reflective of the value that Americans generally place on the market economy, economic well-being, right? Like if you do this, how much is it going to cost society? And what are the benefits to society, right? A lot of times this is conceptualized in the US in terms of the actual monetary value that options offer. And relatedly, from an economic perspective and a public policy perspective, fiscal resources should be used in a way that's prudent, right? Because again, if we're talking about the government spending money to address a problem, or the government, imposing costs on society to address a problem, we need to think about the financial implications of that. Because one is that the government, if they're spending money to address a problem, they're spending public money, right? And so this is important for citizens to know, because they're using your tax dollars, right? And so efficiency is important because it keeps, in some sense, it can help keep policymakers accountable, right? But also we need to think about the monetary cost of society from regulation, because if people are out of work, right, or industries are impacted by regulations, it can bring in less tax money that way, right? Where if a whole industry shuts down, there's less revenue being produced, and so there's less money going into the government to support other policies and programs, right? And so efficiency is kind of, again, this really important evaluative criteria that is used to measure various policy options to address any given problem. Generally speaking, when we think about the costs outweighing the benefits, we think about this in terms of opportunity costs, right? So again, let me back up. So if you're introduced with a problem, you're measuring it in terms of efficiency, and let's say the costs are much larger than the benefits for a particular policy instrument. Well, this is a problem because policymakers think about a term called, or a concept called, opportunity cost, right? Opportunity cost is basically this thing of like, what's the lost opportunity of investing money in this particular area, right? So from your perspective, if you think about opportunity, and if you've taken economics classes, you probably talked about opportunity cost. You can quantitatively measure this. We're not going to do that, obviously, in this class. But opportunity cost is really relevant because, like, from a personal perspective, just think about a time, right, when you've gone and done an activity, and that activity costs money. At the very least, that activity costs time. So let's say, okay, let me back up. Okay, so opportunity cost. Let's say it's Saturday, right? Think back to a Saturday or a weekend or a vacation that you've had where you have two options. You can go do two different things, and they're both kind of fun, right? They up front, they're both fun options, fun things that you want to do, but you can only do one, right? So let's say you go do activity A and you don't do activity B, right? And when you go do activity A, you spend time, you spend some money, and activity A really turns out not to be that fun, right? And it ends up being a problem, and you regret it, right? Then you go home from that activity and you're thinking, man, I should have just went and done activity B. I would have been a lot better off, happier, right? This is an example of opportunity cost, right? You invested time, you invested money in certain activity at the cost of investing that time, investing that money in another activity. When in reality, if you had known up front what was going to happen in activity A, that you wouldn't have been as happy at the end of the day, you would have just gone and done activity B, right? And so that's the opportunity cost. When we make a decision to invest resources in one particular policy area or tool rather than another, there's an opportunity cost because we're spending money over here. That money is no longer available to be spent over there, right? This is opportunity cost. And this is really important because, again, when policymakers spend money to implement programs and policies, that money is spent in one area. It's no longer available to be spent in another area. And so it's important for policymakers to think about how they're spending public money because they want to get the most out of the money that's being used, right? From a rational perspective, we want to use the money and get the most possible value out of it. So, if we think about efficiency from a real world example, and there's, again, many different ways to think about efficiency. One example that the textbook talks about is that in recent years, the Congress has continually reduced the budget for the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, right? And we can see this in the top panel here that the IRS has received less money over time going into 2018. That budget is continuously declining at different rates, right? So you see a decline in the IRS budget. If you look at where this money's coming out of, right? So the IRS is this thing that most of us think about the IRS, and there's a little bit of noise outside, but hopefully you can still hear. But the IRS is generally we think of as this entity that collects taxes, right? And so but they do a lot of different other things. But one of their main activities is collecting taxes, distributing tax returns, and things like this, right? And so, but within the IRS, there's different, departments. So if you work for the IRS, you might work in a specific area. And so you might provide taxpayer services. You can look at the bottom panel there. You might provide operations support for businesses. You might be involved in enforcement, right? Where you're auditing people's taxes. So, these are three different areas of the IRS that people work in. And so we can look at the budget cuts and see that, where do these budget cuts hit the hardest? And so you can see that the enforcement received the largest cuts in 2010 or since 2010, excuse me, that the enforcement branch at the IRS has received the biggest cuts. So what does this mean? Well, it means that there's less enforcement going on, that if tax fraud is occurring or if people aren't paying the correct amount of taxes, that the likelihood of getting caught doing that has decreased, right? It doesn't mean they're still not getting caught, but if enforcement budget goes down, there's fewer monetary resources going into enforcing IRS laws. And so you would expect a decline in catching people for things like tax evasion, not paying their taxes, right? And so a 2014 report looked into this, and they found that for each dollar in the enforcement budget, the agency tends to collect $6 in revenue, all right? So what that means is when you put money based on this report, and you'd have to look into the report a little bit to understand how it comes up with its determinations. But basically what they're saying is that every dollar you put in, if the IRS has this budget, every dollar that they put into enforcement produces $6 in revenue because enforcement is catching tax evasion, they're catching tax fraud, they're collecting money. And so the money that's put into enforcement produces, 6 times more in terms of revenue for the government. And so you might say this is a really efficient, area of the IRS. We spend money to enforce the tax laws, but enforcing those laws produces a lot of good revenue. And so you might say this is really efficient use of public money. And so if we conflate that, or if we switch that to think about, well, we've reduced the budget of enforcement by X amount of dollars, what's the lost opportunity, the opportunity cost of reducing that budget? And they've estimated that, based on the cuts to the IRS and the subsequent cuts to enforcement, that the US government has lost out on billions of dollars annually. And so you might say that, the budget cuts to the IRS and the subsequent cuts to enforcement that the IRS has made is a really inefficient approach to kind of financing tax law enforcement. If you think about who were the biggest winners in these changes to the budget and the subsequent impacts to enforcement, that the wealthier members of society tended to benefit the most, right? And so again, this gets into thinking about, maybe draws or thinking about elite theory, right? We talked about this in the policy theory portion of the course. That elite theory is a theory that says policy elites, people who have greater access, who are more involved in policy decisions, tend to influence the policy process more heavily. And so if we think about, what's causing all this to happen, well, we might think about, well, who benefits the most from these things? And it tends to be wealthier individuals, corporations. And so we might look back and think about, well, why is the IRS budget being cut? Well, it might get back to perhaps lobbying from wealthier individuals and maybe influencing Congress to reduce those things. Another example of efficiency is perhaps to think about smoking, right? If we look at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they report that tobacco use in the US is responsible for about 20%, 1 out of 5 deaths annually. And this translates into, again, these are operational measures. So we can think about this as problem context, right? Defining a problem. Smoking, what's the problem? Smoking caused deaths. It caused about 20% of deaths annually, or 480,000 per year. Or we can think of that as 1,300 deaths per day that can be attributed to smoking in some form or another, right? So we can also think about how many people suffer. They're not dying, but they have smoking-related illnesses, right? So we can quantify that, or try to, as 16 million people suffer from at least one serious illness related to tobacco use. And so this is all a part of problem definition. It helps us to understand the issue. And we can also think about this in terms of dollar value, dollar costs. So how would we do that? Well, the CDC has said that smoking accounts for a loss to the economy of more than $300 billion per year, right? And we can think of this as a portion of it is due to lost economic productivity. So for example, if you're sick, if you are unable to work because of a smoking-related illness, or you die prematurely because of a smoking-related illness, that you're producing less revenue, right? So again, I'm not arguing that the efficiency lens is the most ethical lens, but the efficiency lens tends to use dollar amounts, right? So if we think about the cost of smoking to society, if people are sick, they're less productive, right? So they're producing less revenue, they're producing less tax revenue for the government, they're bringing in less money, therefore they're spending less money. And so there's economic costs associated with smoking and being ill or severely incapacitated from smoking. We can also think about the cost of smoking in terms of health expenditures, right? That if you're inflicted with health ailments related to smoking, that your health expenses are likely to be higher than the average person who doesn't smoke, right? And so we can also quantify these costs and think about how much that costs those individuals and also just society as a whole. And so this brings in the question, well, should governments do more to restrict smoking? And from an efficiency perspective, the question will be, well, how much does it cost to reduce smoking, right? If we want to reduce the cost to society of smoking, we want to implement policy tools that don't cost, more than $300 billion a year to accomplish that, right? Because if you implement some tool to reduce the cost of smoking to society, and implementing that policy costs, $600 billion. Well, from again, an efficiency, a financial perspective, that might not make the most sense. But there are a lot of ways that states are addressing the smoking issue that are relatively efficient from a policy perspective, right? Because if we think about the most common policy tool that is used, is many states use taxes. They also use public information and persuasion, right? If you buy a box of cigarettes, you see kind of the warning label on there. That's information to persuade people to think about perhaps not smoking. So many states have implemented taxes. Every state has kind of the Surgeon General warning on the cigarette box itself. And so here's an example of policy tools being used simultaneously: information, persuasion, and taxing. From an efficiency perspective, taxes are pretty efficient, right? You have to enforce the taxing. You have to have programs to monitor cigarette taxing, and that people or cigarette companies and businesses that sell cigarettes are complying with the tax laws. That costs money, but the tax itself also brings in revenue. And so in some ways, it can be a self-supporting program because it brings in revenue. The revenue that it brings in can be used to support enforcement, right? Certainly, we would imagine that the cost of taxing people to smoke is lower than the overall cost to society of the impacts of smoking. And so again, this would probably be a relatively efficient policy approach for addressing the smoking problem. What are the limited challenges and limitations with efficiency? Well, there's a few. I'm going to highlight a couple of important ones. One is thinking about social benefits and costs in terms of monetary value. This is not always an easy thing to do. If we think about something like illegal immigration, you know, um, evaluating the cost of illegal immigration to society, well, we can think about instances where we can actually quantify costs, but it's really based on something actually happening and an observable event happening, right? You can also think about benefits of immigration, but again, these is really reliant on sometimes invisible numbers that we have to project. The numbers are not readily available because if we're talking about illegal immigration, we're talking about undocumented individuals, and so the lack of documentation, if they're not paying taxes, for example, working under the table jobs, having actual quantitative data can be a challenge. And so a lot of times these estimates of the cost versus the benefits of illegal immigration are reliant on models, and there's a lack of sufficient, really quantitative data. We can also think about challenges of efficiency in terms of actually, estimating the benefits. So one is the reliability of having actual data to determine the costs and benefits, right? Another is thinking about how should we calculate the benefits and the costs, right? A classic example of this is thinking about the value of a human life, right? So as I mentioned, with the cell phones and driving, with the smoking, even with environmental laws, public health laws, a lot of times from an efficiency perspective, one of those measurements, whether it be a benefit or a cost to society, is a human life, right? Are we saving lives? This is providing a benefit. Are we losing lives? This is causing a cost, right? How do we quantify the value of a human life? This is a very ethically driven debate about what is the value of a human life, right? And so sometimes estimating these benefits, estimating these costs can be challenging, and really from an ethical perspective, perhaps questionable, right? Also, we have this issue and we'll talk about equity in a second, but the equity of the efficiency itself, that a lot of times benefits and costs are not equally distributed across society, right? When we think about spending policies, right? If we think about, what is the grant that we get to go to school if you're eligible based on income, Pell Grants, right? Pell Grants, for example, go to certain students who meet certain criteria. I'm not advocating that we get rid of them by any means, but it's important to understand that Pell Grants are not received by everybody, and so spending policies like Pell Grants, redistributive policies, like social welfare policies, these types of programs tend to benefit certain populations based on eligibility, right? But generally, these programs are funded by everybody that pays taxes. And so this kind of issue politically, this can become an issue politically, right? Where, why am I paying into this thing that doesn't provide any benefits to me, right? So it's important to consider that when we're evaluating different policies, right? Especially from an efficiency perspective. Okay, there's benefits and there's costs to this particular policy. How are those benefits and costs distributed across society? Are certain groups going to receive benefits? Are other groups not going to receive those benefits? Are certain groups going to experience higher costs? Are other groups going to experience lower costs? Because this helps us to understand kind of the political implications of an efficiency policy, right? So as I already mentioned, a redistributive policy is this policy essentially that collects money from everybody, but then only allocates that money to certain groups or eligible individuals within society. Um, if we think about things like regulatory policies, um, and the distribution of costs, right? So if we regulate a particular industry to address a problem, like let's say the plastic bag industry is being damaged or hurt, obviously, by plastic bag bans, right? But arguably all of society benefits because we have improved conditions due to less plastics being in the environment, right? And again, those benefits can be difficult to quantify. What's the value of banning plastic bags? This is difficult to quantify monetarily, but we can think about the cost to industry in terms of plastic ban bags, and the cost of that regulation is disproportionately distributed to that particular industry or those particular businesses that profit from plastic bag production, right? And so we have to think about these things from an efficiency perspective. When we're measuring the benefits and the costs, we want to think about the distribution of those benefits and costs as well. And so again, this is an important criteria, efficiency, and there's different challenges associated with applying this criteria. But it is important that we understand that efficiency perspective serves as an important evaluative criteria for thinking about policy. I think the last thing we're going to talk about today is equity, um, and as an evaluative criteria. And equity is kind of, again, there's some overlap with equity and efficiency as we just looked at. We can think about the distribution of different costs and benefits across society or groups within society. When we talk about equity as an evaluative criteria, what we're really talking about is just fairness or justice, right? Equality in the distribution of a policy's costs, benefits, risks across different subgroups within society, right? And so often these discussions are central to redistributive policies, as I just mentioned. When you're taking money or when you create a policy, like a spending policy that brings in money from everybody in a community, but then allocates that money to only certain groups within a community. This is again, we might say, well, yes, this is an important allocation of policy to have. Some people have questioned those types of policies based on equity issues, right? Who receives the benefits, who does not, and who pays the costs, right? And again, I'm not saying I'm in this camp, right? But just to play devil's advocate, that some people say, well, why, again, as I already mentioned, why should I pay into something that I don't receive benefits from, right? This is the common argument that we see. And so understanding the distribution of the benefits and costs is important. Oftentimes we think about it from a redistributive policy perspective. And again, when we're talking about who benefits, right, we might be talking about the wealthy versus the middle class versus the less wealthy. We might be talking about communities of color being disproportionately impacted by certain policies over other groups. We might talk about urban people who live in urban environments versus rural environments. We might talk about just regular citizens versus large corporations, right? There's a lot of ways to think about equity and the impacts of different policies and their equity implications, right? So, if we're talking about a tax, we have to think about, well, if we're going to tax, if we're going to ban plastic bags and we're going to charge a tax for, the use of paper bags, what options do lower income individuals who might be monetarily limited have, right? How are we going to address that inequitable impact in this particular policy, right? So when we think about equity from a policy tool perspective, we identify, the unequal distribution of benefits and costs of a policy. That allows policymakers to then come back and think about, well, how can we redesign the policy that we want to implement to address this problem in a way that is more equitable, right? So acknowledging or thinking about the equity impacts, the benefits and costs of a policy action allows us to think about, you know, um, how can it be addressed? How can we improve this particular instrument to address this equity issue? At a broader scale, the question or the issue of equity um, was brought up in recent times with kind of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And again, this is just one example from a broader perspective. And this Occupy Wall Street movement really focused on equity in terms of the distribution of income across society. This idea of the 1% versus the 99%, where, again, 1% of the US population accounts for most of US wealth versus 99% of the population accounting for a lower portion of the country's wealth. And this idea of economic inequality, and this really rose sharply across the globe. And at the end of the 2011, 2010, 11, there was a lot of evidence coming out that showed that, and again, globally, this was an issue, but in the U.S. in particular, that both wealth and income in the U.S. had become increasingly unequal. And so policymakers amidst this movement, right? So you have the Occupy movement, which is raises the issue of inequality onto the political agenda. Policymakers start to think about tax cuts. What are the merits of those tax cuts in terms of their equity implications? Do tax cuts disproportionately benefit wealthier individuals or corporations over the average member of society? And we have to think about, maybe, do we want to address these inequity issues in terms of income and wealth through the establishment of different policies, right? And so again, if we think about Bernie Sanders, so leading into this, you have President Obama discussing data showing that the top 1% of the nation, the average income for the top 1% had increased by more than 250%. Across a certain time period, relative to income of average individuals that just kind of barely kept pace with inflation, a rise in the cost of living. And you also have the Organization for Economic Development and Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, identifying, and this is an international organization, identifying that income inequality in the U.S. Was much greater than other developed countries. And so you have a comparison there, that the U.S., inequality is an issue in a lot of places, but across what you might consider to be developed countries, the U.S. has equality issues that are more significant than other places. And so, again, this is high on the political agenda. In 2016, Bernie Sanders brought this issue up as kind of one of his campaign items. That he wanted to address, and this is also during his most recent campaign. He wanted to address income inequality, and so again, thinking about equality is a really important evaluative criteria. Again, it allows us to really think about the equity impacts of policies that we've implemented and maybe should be changed, but also policies we're thinking about implementing, and maybe then responding to those questions of equality before we actually adopt some type of policy to address a given problem. The last thing that I want to talk about is ethics and political values in policy analysis itself, right? So as a policy analyst, there's two different ways to analyze an issue and potential policy solutions to that issue. The two kind of broad ways to analyze or apply policy analysis is through what's called positive analysis and normative analysis, right? Positive analysis is really just objective or seeks to be objective and just, really based on facts. And maybe I shouldn't have put fact-based in there, because normative analysis is also generally based on facts. But the most important thing about positive analysis is that it really seeks to be objective, right? Just the facts. here's what exists. That's an easy way to remember positive analysis. This is what exists. I'm just letting you know the facts. This is what is, right? Normative analysis is a little more subjective and value-based, meaning normative analyses present facts. They present information that's reliable for the most part, right? But they tend to be a little more subjective and value-based in terms of how they interpret those facts, right? So while objective analysis presents information, this is what exists, right? Normative analysis is more likely to present information and tell you why that's good or why it's bad, right? So normative analysis is more along the lines of what should exist, right, rather than what does exist. So positive analysis, this is what exists. Normative analysis, this is what ought to exist, or how we should change things, right? And so positivists, people that apply positive analysis, tend to argue that policy analysts really shouldn't include ethical or normative dimensions in their work, right? There's many good reasons why this might be the way to go, right? In that one, if you're a policy analyst, you're presenting information, you don't want your credibility to be questioned, right? And so presenting information in an objective way can help to preserve credibility. You don't want to be seen perhaps as an advocate for a particular movement. And so positive analysis tends to rely on objectiveness and perhaps reduce the opportunity for others to question your credibility. And the rationale behind this is, well, look, I'm just going to present you with the information about this policy issue. Excuse me. And it's really up to policymakers and interest groups and the public to determine kind of the normative aspects of this issue, what should exist. That's not my call. I'm going to present you with information. Let everybody else figure out what should be. On the other side, normative people that kind of rely on normative analysis argue that really there is a role for ethics and values in policy analysis, that we should be interpreting or interjecting values and ideas about the world and what should exist from a policy perspective into the policymaking process and for that matter, policy analysis process, right? And the rationale is that, again, many modern policy issues require us to think about ethics. With the coronavirus, there's a lot of ethical questions about the response to the coronavirus. Who is it impacting more when we have these shelter-in-place orders? Who benefits from the stimulus that's happening? Who's not benefiting from that stimulus payment? You can think about, who is impacted more by the coronavirus itself over others. I asked you to do some reading about that for assignment 3. But this is what normatives, argue, is that, there are ethical questions related to public problems, and there's ethical questions related to analysis of those problems and potential policy solutions. And so we can't ignore them, that they should be included in our analyses, and they don't hinder, but they enhance those analyses, right? And so these are the two arguments. Neither one is necessarily right or wrong. They're just very different perspectives, perhaps, on how policy analysis ought to occur. And they both have their kind of pluses and minuses, right? Because if you're applying a normative approach, right, and you're highlighting different ethical issues around a policy problem, people may call you out and say, well, that person's advocating for this, right? And that can maybe in some cases reduce your credibility because you're seen as an advocate rather than more of an analyst. But that's the risk that's taken, right? So let's see, I'm going to skip over this. But what I want to say last is that, there's a lot of different ways that we can analyze policy. Again, we looked at effectiveness, we looked at efficiency, we looked at equity. These are just 3 evaluative criteria that we can use to assess and compare different policy approaches to address any given problem. But there's also other criteria: political feasibility, risk, rights and freedoms, issues of constitutionality. There's a lot of different evaluative criteria we can use, but it's important to understand that each has their strengths and weaknesses and their trade-offs. if we talk about, an efficiency perspective, we're looking at, the public welfare, benefits versus cost to society. But if we're talking about regulation to achieve those benefits and costs, we might be addressing or imposing issues or questions of rights and liberties in terms of individual or the freedom of enterprise, right? So, when you analyze one problem, you might find, hey, this isn't a really efficient, regulation is a very efficient way to address this problem. But that regulation might not, might rank lower. So it might be really highly ranked in terms of its efficiency, but in terms of its, questions of individual freedom impacts, it might be ranked really low, right? And so evaluative criteria allow us to really compare different policy options across different criteria, to think about, again, what is the best option to choose across all criteria. And again, this is really important because it allows policymakers, it allows interest groups, it allows the public, if done in a transparent way, it allows all these groups to be, more aware, more informed, um, about, how different tools are being analyzed and why they're being selected over others, right? And so that's, again, the value of policy analysis and using evaluative criteria. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and close up, but just remember assignment 3 is posted. It's due on Sunday night. I'll post some reminders about this. I am going to hold an office hour on Thursday, and I'll get some information about that up shortly. All right. Stay safe, stay healthy. And if you have any questions that come up, feel free to send me an email.